classics. I'm not going to read through it or anything. There are a couple of sources that I will use. And then at the back, there's a very limited bibliography, a couple of the things that I'll mention a few, and just some other things that are foundational to my work. For the ancient Romans, geography, climate, and property arrangements made water a scarce resource. Yet water was essential for producing anything but subsistence crops, which were grown with dry farming methods. During rainless summers, irrigation was needed, especially for fruits, vegetables, and flowers raised for the market. Of course, it was advantageous to have a source of water on one's own property, but this was not always possible, because water sources were unevenly distributed in relation to settlement, as indicated by the results of survey archaeology. So I've just started with a map to show you. You have a pointer, so I can stay at the microphone, don't you? Well, anyway, I have the red arrow where Rome is. I'm looking mostly at the region, just draw a circle right around Rome. And then the surveys have been summarized. This is the same area of Italy, the different quadrants of survey. And I've just picked one, which is number 9 here, just as a sample to show you the distribution. Here are the water resources. So the big lumps are the sites where there's a farmhouse. The dotted lines are the streams. The Roman aqueducts have the big bumps on them, so there's one big one that runs through here. I'm mostly concerned with the streams and the way the farms are scattered around. Not every farm is going to have a stream. Well, that looks terrible. Okay, so this physical landscape created a situation in which landowners competed for access to local water supplies. The English word rival, in fact, derives from the Latin word rivalis, a person who shared a channel. To manage this competition, the Romans used a variety of legal arrangements involving both public and private law. Private sources were streams or springs that arose on private property, and they belonged to the landowner. Public sources included both navigable rivers, lakes, and man-made resources such as a municipal aqueduct. In this paper, I will look at Roman legal arrangements that show both public and private law depended on principles that we now associate with commons theory. My analysis of Roman law takes inspiration from commons theory, which focuses on tight-knit communities similar to the ones surrounding local water supplies in the Roman world. A commons is a communally owned resource that can be destroyed when everyone who uses it in pursuit of his own individual gain, leading to a tragedy of the commons. Preventing such tragedies is possible in tight-knit communities that are aware of environmental constraints and rely on informal social controls to limit access to a scarce resource, conserving it and at the same time satisfying economic needs. A commons is usually supported by shared social norms and relationships, and these informal mechanisms often work in concert with the law, as Ellickson has shown in his study of Northern California, where he charted different kinds of controllers or mechanisms for enforcing the rules. And his summarizing chart is the first item on my handout. I will use Ellickson's different types of controllers to show how Roman law integrated different levels of control. I apply these categories to 3 kinds of evidence from the Roman world: literature, inscriptions, and that's Latin texts written on stone in this case, and legal cases drawn from the Digest of Justinian, a 6th century AD compilation of the writings of Roman legal experts or jurists from the preceding 7 centuries. Though the Digest is a compilation, scholars generally agree that it is a reliable source for the law of the Republican and Imperial periods, roughly 100 BC to AD 300, the same historical era to which the literature and the inscriptions belong. I begin with private water sources because they come first historically. That is, private water law develops earlier than public water law in the Roman world. Already in the 5th century BC, Roman private law had an institution to regulate water sharing agreements, and it was called a servitude. And servitudes are like modern easements, which grant someone a right to use someone else's property. A landowner could arrange a servitude to channel or draw water from a spring or a stream on a neighbor's property, and servitudes could be used only to support agricultural production. Servitudes were embedded in social relationships and the patterns of agricultural work. and their legal form reflects these constraints. First, servitudes could be established only on adjacent property. Second, water governed by a servitude could not be shared informally with others. But though the legal right was indivisible, the water resource itself could be shared among several different people, each of whom held a separate servitude to use the same stream or spring. In these cases, the water was often distributed according to a schedule. Time schedules were a convenient mechanism for rationing because they required little technology and relied on easily observed and familiar benchmarks, days and seasons, for example, that were already used to organize the farming work that the water supplies served. Servitudes brought neighbors into close contact, crossing a neighbor's property to draw water or maintaining a channel on someone else's land. And these interactions could generate conflict. The first line of defense was self-policing, grounded in Roman norms of neighborly behavior. Roman discussions of neighbors emphasized limited interactions that are aimed at self-sufficiency, the farmer's traditional goal. These expectations are echoed by the jurist Celsus in a legal case about a servitude for a right-of-way. Although a servitude gave its holder a broad right to use his neighbor's property, there were limits. Celsus writes that a right-of-way must be exercised respectfully, civiliter modo. The adverb civiliter echoes the Latin term for private law, jus civile, the law for Roman citizens, implying inherent values shared by the community. As Celsus writes, for certain things are assumed tacitly in this term. Celsus explains that this means you don't lead your path through the house or through the vineyard. In support of his opinion, he cites another case, this one about a water servitude, with the rule that the route of the channel cannot be changed. The holder of the servitude should use his judgment and exercise his right without causing damage to his neighbor's property. That is, exercising a servitude depended on personal ethics, Elixon's first-party controller. The coordination of servitudes with other farm work suggests that shared social norms were also expected to support water-sharing arrangements. This is Elixon's second level of control. The servitude was not a legal contract, so it doesn't exactly fit Elixon's second level, but it did provide the basis for a legal claim if other methods of enforcement failed. So his third-level controller was also an option. Unfortunately, we have no evidence to show how frequent lawsuits about servitudes were, but because social control was less costly than a lawsuit and reducing costs was a primary strategy that the Romans relied on, informal enforcement was probably preferred, as indicated by Celsus's legal opinion. Turning to public water sources, I take as an example the small municipal aqueduct that the Emperor Augustus built for the town of Venafro, which is, so there's Rome and Venafrum. It brought water from the springs at Volturno, somewhere up in those hills, and it brought it down to the city. I don't have a picture of the water things itself, but you can see the outline of the amphitheater that Augustus also built for the theater in the modern street plan still. And I do have, this is a marvelous website that is mapping all the Roman aqueducts in the Roman world. You can see the green line of the aqueduct coming down the hillside. So I'm going to look at a public law that regulated this inscription, this aqueduct that's preserved for us in an inscription, partially preserved. And it gives us the rules for public administration by magistrates who were empowered to do three things. They could divide and allot the water in order to sell it. They could impose or establish a fee for the purpose. And they made a contract governing the allocation. The content of the contract was determined by the decree of the town councilman. Presumably the contract set out the fee and the terms and all of those things. The public law at Venafrum was thus similar to private law to the extent that it limited access to water with schedules and volume. But the social context of the law was quite different because the administrative process separated those who used the water from those who had power to control the system. The system at Venafrum is a hybrid, really, of Elixon's second and third level controllers. If an individual wanted to use water from the Venafrum aqueduct, he would enter into a legal contract with the city, mediated through a magistrate. In contrast, servitudes were agreements between neighbors that were formalized in law, and even long-standing practice could be recognized as a servitude. Where servitudes were embedded in close local relationships among the people who used the water, at Venafro, water sharing was arranged in a purely legal relationship, and a legal relationship with the state. The system at Venafro did involve a community of sorts. The town assembly had authority over the water from the aqueduct. It voted on the decree that both authorized the magistrates to act and specified the terms for allocating the water. The decree was to represent a majority consensus because it specified that at least 2/3 of the assembly must participate in voting on the decree. But this was a consensus of the local aristocracy that belonged to the assembly. Venafro was a small town, and its aristocracy could certainly be considered a close-knit community, but the assembly was not necessarily coterminous with the community of water users. The fee could have minimized this distinction between membership in the assembly and the water users if the fee was high enough to price out anyone but the political elite. But there's some evidence, which we'll consider shortly, to suggest that this was unlikely. It's not surprising that the Venafro decree privileged the wealthy elites because ancient Roman society was hierarchical, but in terms of efficient water sharing, the public system was less effective than private law because it relied on centralized third-party enforcement. Because the Venafro aqueduct was regulated by a centralized administration rather than by those who used the water, public law was not supported by the same kind of close-knit community that framed servitudes in private law. The Venafro decree is a fairly early example of public law on water, and there's some evidence that the Roman government recognized the problems inherent in this kind of system and tried to solve them. First, there are a couple of inscriptions documenting local water sharing agreements. Here's one from Tivoli, which is their horizontal arrow there, Tibur, modern Tibur, that shows, it depicts a local aqueduct and it shows the names and the allocations of the water by volume and time. Such an inscription could facilitate enforcement by providing a visual representation of the community of water users that reminded them of the shared norms and values that should guide their behavior. In a public law context, an inscription could promote first and second level enforcement, the informal mechanisms that private law assumed. The second piece of evidence shows that the Roman government recognized different types of enforcement work together. The evidence comes from a legal case about a public river that was treated as a commons, that is, owned by and open to all. In the case, the water from a river was distributed to a group of people in amounts proportional to their land holdings. It's not clear what dispute led to the legal claim, but it was brought to the emperors Antoninus Pius and Lucius Verus, roughly between 160 and 170 AD, and they issued a ruling, or what we call a rescript. They said that, quote, water from a public river for irrigating fields should be divided in proportion to the property holdings, unless someone show that more has been given to him by an individual right. And that water is allowed to be channeled in this way if it can be done without harm to anyone else. The rescript mentions several different mechanisms for managing conflict: proportional allocation, individual rights, and self-policing. The individual rights here probably refer to grants made by the government, whether that was the emperor in Rome or a local authority, we don't really know. These grants gave some people a right to more water than others, probably more than what a proportional allocation would provide, creating inequality that could exacerbate conflict. The very existence of the rescript shows that some people used the legal system to secure access to the water from this river. But the content of the rescript affirms informal mechanisms in both proportional distribution and in the prohibition on harm to others. And since the rescript specifies that the water was used for irrigation, it's clear that these informal mechanisms counterbalance the private economic interests of those who shared the water, just as in servitudes. The importance of informal mechanisms is explicitly addressed in my third piece of evidence, the writings of Frontinus, a Roman senator who was in charge of Rome's water supply around 100 AD. Frontinus wrote a treatise on the aqueducts of Rome and their administration, and in passing, he describes a small municipal system comparable to the one at Venafro. The system served the residents of Tusculum, a town near Rome, up on the slopes of the Alban volcano, near the place where we saw the survey in the beginning of the talk. These people shared water from a local stream called the Crabra. As Frontinus wrote, all the villas along its course draw water allocated in turn by day and delivery gauges. The system was administered by the local government, which imposed a fee for use. Frontinus seems impressed that the system worked because he characterizes the behavior of the people of Tusculum as involving restraint, moderatio, which suggests that there was some incentive not to be virtuous. In fact, it is likely that many of them had an economic interest in the water because Tusculum was ideally located to transport garden crops to the city of Rome. Cicero, for example, had market gardens on his property there. Frontinus, who managed the city aqueducts, recognized that municipal administration was not enough. Also necessary were informal mechanisms, first and second level controllers, the same kind of self-policing and community enforcement that supported servitudes in private law. Frontinus also knew what happened when the mechanisms of enforcement failed, as happened famously in Rome's aqueducts, a large municipal system governed by public law. To channel water from a city aqueduct, an individual needed a special right granted by the emperor, and, as at Venafrum, the system privileged the elite with social connections to the imperial household. But not even all Roman elites had access to the city aqueducts, never mind small landowners. The system was rife with corruption. Frontinus complains repeatedly about the number of illegal taps and the imperial watermen who sold water from the aqueducts for private property. Those excluded from the system went around the law to gain access, and they were willing to pay for it, creating a lucrative black market. The system at Venafrum invited the same kind of cheating. Those who could not afford the fee would have a clear motive to steal the water and were not included in the community that made and enforced the rules. Others might avoid contracts in hopes of getting a better deal on the side, either paying less than the prescribed fee or possibly even paying more for added benefits. A fee for use, then, as noted above, did not necessarily promote a cohesive community to enforce water sharing by informal means. Instead, a fee system exploited existing socioeconomic divisions and encouraged market exchange, as in the black market for water from the Roman aqueducts. To sum up, both public law and private law were embedded in social relationships in ancient Rome. But where private law relied on these relationships and shared values to enforce water sharing arrangements, public law undermined the sense of community that empowered informal mechanisms by sharpening distinction between those who had a right to use the water and those who did not. Paradoxically, perhaps, both systems probably generated an efficient allocation of water in Coas's sense of serving both individual economic needs and the general welfare. Private law achieved efficiency because informal enforcement was less costly than the legal system. The public system, however, was efficient mostly in its failure, that is, through the black market that reallocated water from public aqueducts on the basis of market value. But the emperor and public officials like Frontinus seem to have recognized the problem. In addition to the rescript discussed here, there were 2 second-century inscriptions about municipal aqueducts in which public law explicitly adopts community practices and social enforcement. Taken together, the evidence points to a learning curve in imperial administration as Roman public law adopted the models from private water law and local practices, both of which offer the advantages of informal social controls.
We will now have Marco Lopez presenting to us The Power of Water, Industrial Agriculture, Resource Inequalities, and Indigenous Farm Worker Resistance. Please welcome him with a round of applause.
Well, first I'd like to begin by thanking both Kat and Timmy for their invitation to allow me to present some of the findings from my research today. I'd also like to thank Luz Cordova, who helped me gather much of the materials when I was in Baja, and then also Oscar Portillo, who's been translating away a lot of these interviews for the past year and a half. So what I'm going to share with you today are part of a larger project that compares the cross-border organization of strawberry production, farm worker organizing, and the United States and in Mexico. And for that matter, I'd be happy to draw comparisons to the California's Central Coast region during the Q&A. Got it. Now we're ready to go. So I'd like to start first by taking you into the region. This is a picture from the region of the San Quintin Valley in Baja California. Now the picture that you see here is of the Transpeninsular Highway that cuts through the length of the state in Mexico. During the late 1800s, it was a British colony that was later abandoned 10 years after massive drought, when the British came down and realized that they couldn't really do anything because there was no water in this region. Up until after that, it's been sparsely populated, mostly by Mexicanos who have earned, at that time, what was referred to as ejidos, and mostly planting wheat and barley up until about the 1970s. In the 1970s, export-oriented firms who produced tomatoes from right across the border in San Diego decided to come down and start producing tomatoes because of the access to cheaper labor that they could eventually import from southern Mexico. By the mid-1990s, an ag economist at UC Davis stated that industrial agriculture in the region was no longer viable. This was due because of overdrafting of the groundwater aquifer, and that led to chronic saltwater intrusion. And in a sense, she labeled this area an agricultural wasteland. Now, the region of San Quintin lies about 4 hours south of the U.S.-Mexico border, and is now an agricultural region that produces fresh strawberries for the winter and fall market in the United States. Among other fruits, it also produces raspberries and blueberries and continues to sparsely produce tomatoes. The way it works is that fruits typically transported to distribution centers just across the border in Yuma, Arizona, and in San Diego, California. Now, in starting this work, I asked a few different research questions. The first one was, how have agricultural firms been able to set up export-oriented production in a region despite freshwater scarcity? And then second is, how do class and racial differences manifest themselves through the local labor market and the ability to access water? Now, to answer these questions, there's a set of methods that I'd like to point out that I did. First and foremost, or one of the first things I did was I did farm tours with growers and with agricultural firms, asking them how it was that they produced strawberries or raspberries and tomatoes at different parts of the season, how they saw themselves as being competitively advantaged, and asking them about the science of growing strawberries and how they manage their labor in the region. I also carried out 50 in-depth interviews with indigenous farm workers to make sense of the organization of work, labor conditions, and indigenous migration. And lastly, extensive ethnographic research in indigenous farm worker communities to understand the challenges that farm workers encountered, their relationship to the local state and agricultural firms, and most importantly, what I was getting at is how they saw themselves in terms of organizing. Now, as I mentioned, strawberry production in the San Quintin Valley is a late fall, early winter endeavor. Okay, and it's pretty much everything that's produced there is for the consumption in the United States. One of the reasons, there's two reasons for driving this is, like I pointed out, people in the United States want to be able to have fresh strawberries during the winter months, and so you can buy them at your local supermarket or as we have them here at our local co-op. The second one was that there was a turn in the market towards organic strawberry production. And according to the regulations for organic production in the United States, a field must be pesticide-free for more than 3 years. Because of the high turnover costs or transfer costs from conventional to organic in the state of California, Baja California seemed like a viable alternative for producing organic strawberries. Now, I want to point out what it costs or what firms earn at market price in terms of selling strawberries during these months of January and February, for instance. A conventional 8-pound flat of conventional strawberries will yield a grower $18 in the market, where an organic flat will yield a grower about $32 during these months. In comparison, a worker who harvests that box or that tray of strawberries earns 10 pesos for each box that they harvest, which is roughly about $1. Okay. And when they are doing non-harvest activities, it's 52 pesos, which translate roughly to $4 a day. Now, there's three ways in which the industry has organized itself in the region. The first is wholly owned, so firms such as Driscoll Berry will come in and set up the infrastructure for producing strawberries. Now, the problem with this system is that all the risk is on them. And so as we've learned through capitalism, those who control the means of production try to alleviate as much risk as possible. So wholly owned is a way of establishing a production system, but it's long-term wise, it's not feasible. The second step is what firms refer to as a share grower, not sharecropper, share grower, in which they take an established grower, frequently from the United States, set up the system for them, and then lease the land and the water harvesting technologies that are associated with that piece of land. And then, again, the grower is mandated to sell the strawberries to them. And the last one is where the firm separates itself from any type of risk in the fields. Well, they will lease the rights to a particular strawberry plant to a grower, and then the grower is required to sell back the harvest to the firm. And this is what's most often done. Now, the problem with this last situation is that the entrance into strawberry production, Baja, is quite capital intensive. And so not any grower can come into the system and say, I want to grow strawberries and I've got my university degree and step in. Firms are required, or growers are required to have their own desal plant, for instance, to harvest that water that is deeply salinated. So a way of overcoming this is that growers themselves organized a lobbying group they refer to as El Consejo Agrícola, which translates to the Agricultural Commission of Baja California. And through this, they were able to petition the federal government through the Secretariat of Agriculture to gain water subsidies for the construction of privately owned water desal plants used solely for irrigating strawberries and raspberries, in which they received a 50% subsidy for the construction, and also received a 3-cent subsidy for each kilowatt hour of energy used for harvesting or taking out the salt out of the water, and which comes out to about a 15% subsidy on market rate. Essentially, what's this done is it's created a region with what I would refer to as water barons who control agriculture in the region, and it's come down to there being a handful of no more than 10, and if you separate it by family, probably 5 people or 5 families that control agriculture in the valley. Now, I'd like to juxtapose this with the people who pick the strawberries, pick the raspberries in the region. Now, I use the term strangers in their own land because most indigenous people who came to this area or come to this area are not seen as citizens in the state of Mexico, even though they were born in Mexico. And I'll provide an explanation for this. So indigenous people began to migrate from the region from southern Mexico in the late 1970s to early 1980s after labor brokers recruited them to pick tomatoes. They lured them with tales of free housing and gainful employment, only to find cramped living conditions in dilapidated labor camps and earnings that they quickly lost in the frontier economy, where everything was for purchase, including food and water. As Lucia, a Mixteca farm worker, stated, "My parents brought me to the valley after we had migrated from Oaxaca and then Sinaloa. I cried when I saw my new living conditions. I could not believe that I was living in the desert with nothing to account for." Now, for many of you who have been to southern Mexico, the landscape is quite different, where if you need to produce your own food, you can harvest timber and you can use that to cook for cooking and for heating. If you need to gather water, you simply go down to the stream and this is in the parte alta de la Mixteca in Oaxaca. Now, newly arrived migrants found themselves stuck in the desert. Now, in preparation for NAFTA, the Mexican government implemented neoliberal land reforms in the early 1990s that allowed growers in the region to swallow up the land's arable land and motivated them to push farm workers out of their labor camps. And with that, other landowners sold small parcels for residential living. These parcels included no infrastructure such as potable water, electricity, and sewage, and essentially, in many ways, they were sold without proper documentation. So any piece of land could be held by 3 people, and the seller is nowhere to be found, and the seller is not responsible for setting up this type of infrastructure. What's happened is that you have basically squatter communities that have set up around the edges of each town that feed into the labor systems of local agricultural firms. Now, there are no indigenous people lack citizenship because they are unable to access the civil and indigenous rights without an acta de nacimiento. Since many of them were born in rural Oaxaca, many of them in homes, many of them not in hospitals, they don't have the birth certificate that claims for them, that shows for them to be Mexican citizens. Now, with this, they are ineligible for state-mandated health care, which is Seguro Social, which they earn through their work, autonomy and territory, which are granted to them through the San Andres Accords after the Zapatista movement in southern Mexico that reformed indigenous rights in Mexico. And lastly, in many cases, public education for their children. Now, growers construct the political construction of the local labor market has given growers and agricultural firms now the best of 2 worlds. Okay? That is a large and stable supply of indigenous farm workers that enables them to have laborers at their disposal during the ups and downs of the annual harvest. And second, undocumented workers that growers can systematically deny labor and human right laws that protect them. So in all cases, pretty much a grower can say, well, I'm not going to pay into that worker Seguro Social because they don't have any type of citizenship or an acta, so they can't even have access to those resources. Or in other cases, because they're undocumented, they'll pay them through cash, and we know how a cash economy works often. So this has led to organizing for rights. Okay, and indigenous communities are made together of pan-indigenous culture. In these colonias, these communities, indigenous people utilize pan-indigenous cultural institutions to recreate a sense of community outside of Oaxaca. And so in many cases, if you see in the picture, if you can see the bottom, where's that clicker? Is it gone? It's okay, I don't need it. Oh, that one. I'm not used to these technologies. Okay. These pictures right here are of a gathering of an asamblea that happen every weekend in which the community leader, this guy right here, Justino, talks about what he will be doing for the community. And he's an elder who's respected. Okay. This gathering down here was of a tequio, okay, in which the community comes together to beautify the community sometimes, or to do things to improve the quality of life for them living together. So it's a different sense of ideas of what it means to be indigenous and what we would think of people being from the outside. Now, by reconstituting these or remaking these institutions, it allows them to remake the sense of what it means to be indigenous in Baja California, even though they're pan-indigenous. Okay. Now, the problem is, as I went back to, is that there is no water in this region. So there are 17 privately owned water desal plants in the region, and there is one that is not fairly efficient, very inefficient, for providing water to indigenous communities. So what the government has done is provided no subsidies for providing communities with water, and what they've done actually is they tell communities, well, if you want to, provide the infrastructure for your community to get running water, you'll have to pay for it. Okay? Or what they do is they increase water rates so that it indirectly comes out of the water rates. So as of 3 years ago, communities were coming together and saying, you cannot raise our water rates. You can't do this without even asking us. And so at one point, they wanted to raise the water rates to 100 pesos, which translates to about $10 a month. But remember, people are on a very fixed budget, to say the least. So the Comité de Colonias that's been formed has allowed the indigenous communities to, in many ways, pressure the local government, made up mostly of mestizos and the water barons, and ask for the water rates to be lowered. Now, in protest, what workers have asked for is 52.50, a water rate of 50.50, which acts as a symbolic marker of the daily rate in which people earn. Okay, that's the minimum wage in Mexico, $4 a day. So in early 2009, the 11 communities came together to address the pending water rate increase. With local government officials in attendance, Juan, a Triqui farm worker, asked them, how do you expect us to pay for our increasing water bill when we are paid so little? I can't afford to buy my family fruit, let alone meat. And so through this campaign, they've been able to push and gain leverage in terms of asking for other rights, and in a long-term future, thinking about how to gain those actas de nacimiento, how to gain recognition in terms of the politics of the region. Now, in concluding remarks, I'd like to add two things. Now, maintaining indigenous cultural institutions is key to recreating a sense of community outside of Oaxaca. And in this case, indigenous farm workers use their unequal access to water as a discursive tool to highlight the material inequalities that separate themselves from mestizo landowners in the region. Now, in 2010, pointed a very significant turn. Justino, who was one of the indigenous organizers in that area, who had organized the 11 communities, was named municipal delegate by the mayor of Ensenada. They said it's basically the county of Ensenada. So with that, in many ways, he was able to influence social and political policy in the town in which his colonia sat in. Okay. The second one is more of a theoretical idea in which the studies of migrant resistance or migrant labor resistance can't stand alone. And here in the United States, we've seen quite a bit of studies of, for instance, the UFW, and in many ways the nostalgicism that rises from above that. Now, because agriculture or agricultural work is innately tied to nature, one of the things that I want to point out is we must bring in an understanding of nature and the opportunities and limitations that it has for labor resistance. And in this way, we saw how the lack of water really created an opportunity for agricultural workers to organize around that in order to push for other things. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcos. Next, we have Daniel Ryan from the Fundación Ambiente y Recursos Naturales from Buenos Aires, Argentina.
Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure for me to be here, my first time in Vermont and in Middlebury. Well, this paper is called Legal Mobilization and the Politics of Water Pollution. This is a paper I've co-authored with Andres Napoli. We both work at FARM. FARM is the translation in Spanish is Foundation for Environment and Natural Resources. FARM is an NGO that do specialize on governance and environmental and development governance and politics. Okay, and with a long tradition of public interest litigation. In fact, Andres Napoli is one of the main lawyers involved in this case of the Matanza-Riachuelo Basin. The research question that we try to address in this paper is how judicialization, the involvement of courts, affects water politics, pollution control politics in the Riachuelo Basin. Why is this important or relevant question? Is because from a conventional legal perspective, there's a tendency to believe judicial order just because a court said it can change state practice and guarantees social rights, including social environmental rights. But there is a large body of literature with already point out the limitation of legal mobilization of courts to produce policy changes. First, because many times courts are not well equipped to deal with complex policy conflicts. And on the other hand, because courts, as Hamilton said, doesn't have the purse, not the sword. So they relied on the other branches of government to implement their orders. So that's the reason this paper address how judicialization and courts how they can affect the water politics. That's what our paper wants to address. I want to conceptualize, make a brief conceptual distinction about two types of judicial impacts that are very common in the literature on legal mobilization and court and social change. Some part of the literature focus on direct impact, okay? Those are basically the behavior and policy changes intended by the courts, okay? So a court said a mining project has to be stopped because it didn't fulfill with environmental impact assessment. So the direct impact is to assess whether the mining project stopped and the court's requirements was fulfilled. Those type of analysis are court-centered, okay? They try to assess the impact of the court. Basically, they try to assess judicial compliance. Another part of the literature focuses on indirect impact. This is a broader concept. The focus here is on consequence of courts' decisions that affects actors and relationships that were not directly the target of the court actions, but nevertheless are related with the court, the issue that the court is addressing. For instance, how the court resolution impact on broader public opinion on an issue, on social mobilization, on broader policy changes. For instance, this has been a big discussion within the U.S. context in regarding to Brown versus Board of Education, the famous landmark case decision of the Supreme Court of the United States that ordered the southern state to desegregate. Okay? This type of analysis are more dispute-centered analysis. They focus not so much on the court, but how the court's resolution affects the way the dispute evolve. Our paper draws from both approaches. It analyzes the impact caused by the involvement of the court, but our analysis is not so much on the level of compliance with the court decision, but how the involvement of the courts changed the political scenario in which the different actors that were involved in this dispute interact. Okay? Most of you are geographers, so last night when I was preparing my PowerPoint presentation, I said, I have to have a map. So just the Matanza-Riachuelo Basin is located in the southern metropolitan, the southern part of the metropolitan area of Buenos Aires, and is a very complex basin. It is located in a highly dense area. About 6 million people live there. If you think that the Argentine population is roughly 40 million, this is an area with 6 million people live, so more than 10% of the Argentine population. According to the 2010 census, 1 million people living there has unsatisfied basic needs, so basically are poor. 55% of the population have access to sewage, and about 35% lack access to the potable water system. This is also a heavily industrialized area. This is the core of the Argentine industrialization model. Around 11, nobody knows exactly how many industrial facilities are in there, but it's about 11,000. Most of them discharge into the different water cores in the basin. And there are over 300 open landfills that are not regulated, with domestic and industrial, even hazardous waste is disposed without control. This gives you an idea, this gives you a scenario in which of a highly polluted area, this is considered the most polluted basin area in Latin America, is considered, according to the Blacksmith Institute, one of the 30 most polluted sites in the world. How is the governance of the Riachuelo Basin? Well, the institutional framework is very complex, okay? You have a multiplicity of jurisdiction at the level of Argentina is a federal government, so it would be great a comparison case study for you. So you have the federal government, 22 different agencies have different level of competence over the basin. You have the government of the city of Buenos Aires, you have the government of the province of Buenos Aires, and you have also 14 municipal governments. This means that state power is highly fragmented. So it produces, and this is complemented with a very strong lack of any type of institutional coordination. So you have a high level of normative and institutional fragmentation that results in a very low level of enforcement of environmental regulations. Okay? Citizen participation, how this, the social aspect. In the last 25 years, there has been an increasing social awareness of and concerns about the social environmental problems affecting the Riachuelo Basin. But collective action is very fragmented in the area, okay? It tends to be focalized in spatial terms and in time, okay? It's reactive to specific situation of environmental emergency. A pollution event in one neighborhood, or a flood situation. So you have sudden social mobilizations. But then this level of collective action is not sustained on time. So there is because of the low level of social articulation, the capacity of social actors to affect public policy at the basin area is very limited. And this is complemented with a strong lack of public information about the environmental quality of the basin. I'm not going to go into the historical detail, but in the last 20 years, there has been several government attempts to try to address the environmental social problems of the basin that failed miserably. In 1993, for instance, remember Argentina returned to democracy in 1983. In 1994, 10 years later, we have a constitutional reform that recognized the right to a clean environment. So during the 90s, there was this strange combination. On the one hand, you have a strong process of neoliberal reforms in the economic field, but at the same time, you have an increased recognition of social and economic rights in the Constitution and legal mobilization around that. So in 1993, the national government created a Comité Ejecutor Matanza Riachuelo. The Secretary of Environment at that time, Maria Julia Alzogaray, made a famous statement. She promised that the Riachuelo will be clean in 1,000 days. So September 1995, the 1,000 days were over. The Freshwater was the same, cleanup plan did not advance. So the government, a new committee, un comité ejecutor de plan gestión ambiental de la cuenca Matanza-Riachuelo. This time they got money. In 1988, the Inter-American Development Bank gave a loan to Argentina, $250 million loan to clean up the Riachuelo. Only $7.7 million were used of that loan. So you have this situation of a political inertia, okay? That everybody knew that there was something that has to be done, but the agenda didn't change. 2002, 2003, National Ombudsman Office get involved in this issue and prepare a report. Actually, the report was prepared for a working group formed by universities and several NGOs, environmental NGOs and human rights NGOs, about the situation of the Riachuelo, what's going on. And based on that report, the National Ombudsman Office issued a resolution declaring the basin, the Riachuelo Basin, a state of environmental and health emergency. And it requests the government, I don't know if you know how an ombudsman office works, but basically it can order, but it can request a government to provide information to take actions. It's interesting to read the responses from the different government agencies, recognizing the need to do something, but there was no real government response. So 2004, a group of local residents filed a legal complaint for individual and collective environmental damage before the Supreme Court of Argentina against the federal government, the city of Buenos Aires, the government of the province of Buenos Aires, the 14 municipalities, and 44 main industries, polluting industries. Nobody really thought that this was going the court was going to take this case. But in 2006, what I am here, the court suddenly accepted the case for collective environmental damage. Okay, so the Riachuelo and the Supreme Court. This is known as the Mendoza case. A very interesting question is here why the Supreme Court got involved in this issue, and we can talk about that later on, but I'm not going to spend time on this right now. Interesting, the court, the people filing the application, which were basically 17 neighbors from a very, very polluted slum called Villa Inflamable. How do you translate that? Inflammable village. It's a slum at the end of the mouth of the Matanza-Riachuelo basin. Filed a claim for individual damage and collective environmental damage. The court, interesting, took the collective environmental damage, which basically is a discussion about public policy, and sent the individual environmental damage, which is basically a liability case, to the ordinary courts. So suddenly the Supreme Court, placed the issue of the Riachuelo in the main political agenda and the center of attention of public opinion. And in, let me see, yes, the court between 2006 and 2008 developed a procedure of public hearings in which NGOs and local residents could come to the court and explain their concern and pose questions to the government officials. 2008, the court finally issued its final order and ordered the governments to develop a program to repair the environment of the basin, prevent future environmental damage, and improve the quality of the population living in the basin. Interesting, the court didn't say the government what they have to do, give discretion to the government about how to achieve this objective. It lists 9 components that have to be addressed by the program that has to be developed by the court. For instance, the government has to develop a public information system, have to develop a system of a report, a quarterly report about the quality of environment. And the court created a commission formed by the Ombudsman Office and the NGOs that were part of the legal procedure to monitor government's compliance. This is called the Cuerpo Colegiado. Do we have 5 minutes? Okay. So, what were the two main impacts of the judicial intervention? We argue that the judicial involvement in the court produced two main consequences in the politics of the basin. First, it overcame a situation of a political inertia that characterized the situation. Let me develop a little more this idea. A main claim of environmental NGOs and social and activists and researchers was that there was a strong lack of coordination in the formulation of policy and enforcement, but there was no real, governments didn't have any incentive to produce any type of interjurisdictional coordination. The short-term costs were very clear. They have many times means that they have to give up enforcement powers to a third actor. They have to allocate funds that they were planned to use to other ends. And at the same time, the potential political benefits of the policy and environmental improvement of a better coordination of the basin were very diffuse and were long-term. So they have this scenario in which governments have short-term costs to get involved into a coordination scheme, long-term and diffuse benefits. In this scenario, it was not surprising that the distinguished feature of the political scenario was inertia. No governmental actor had a real interest in changing the status quo. So the intervention of the court basically what does is taking advantage of a political situation at the moment was to change the cost of benefits of the local governments that were involved. The best evidence, empirical evidence of this is the creation of the Riachuelo Basin Authority. It took 10 months to the three governments, after 20 years of political inaction, it took them 10 months to agree to create the Riachuelo Basin Authority, right after the order of the court. The other interesting, but of course, overcoming the political inaction, moving the political agenda, it didn't mean that the court's resolution was going to be implemented at the end. So the court always have to be involved to increase, to control and monitor that the government is actually implementing the pollution control regulation. Just, I want to give you this figure. 2007, see, this is the number of inspections in the basin. This is the number in 2007 they take when Akumar was created. Okay, the court started to intervene in the case of 2006. 2007, it was created the Akumar. During the first 2 years, between 2007, February 2010, I think, yes, there is almost no movement, in the number of inspections that the governmental agencies were developing the basin. Basically, it means that governmental agencies were not exercising their enforcement power. After the court issued a fine over the heads of the environmental agency and the main heads of the agency at the provincial and municipal level, it produced a dramatic change. So how it looks. So from 2010 to 2012, you see a tremendous increase. And running out. Can I have one more minute? And the other strong impact of the judicial intervention is that it strengthens the political leverage of certain social actors to be part of the policy process, okay? And this is interesting. Judicialization increased the access of certain political actors and the political leverage of the actor to be part of the policy process, but only of those that were part of the judicial procedures. Basically, that means that very developed, professionalized environmental NGOs, human rights NGOs, were able to be part of the judicial procedure because of the spaces opened by the court through the monitoring commission. It allows these actors to be part of the political process. However, participation of local groups is still very low. That raised a lot of interesting normative and empirical questions about judicialization. To what extent these actors, I work in an NGO that is part of this commission, are we accountable, representative of a broader population that is involved in the basin? Okay, I'm going to cut there. Thank you very much. There is a site of her, and in that site, if you're more interested about the case, you can find information about it. Thank you.
What a fabulous set of papers. I have plenty of questions myself, but I want to give us about hopefully 25 minutes for discussion, for questions. So I will go ahead and start accepting questions, and then we're going to use the microphone so that we can record it well. So let me bring it to you.
Hi. I had a question for Cynthia about water rights. What you were talking about made me think about growing up in the suburbs of Minneapolis and different days that you're allowed to water your lawn. And there would be days when I would go over to a friend's house and it would be raining outside, and yet the sprinklers were on. And that made me crazy. And I was wondering, you were talking a little bit about this idea of fees and access to this sort of common resource, the idea that a fee or some type of access in that way actually impedes this idea of a social community, this importance of the water, that type of thing, kind of an awareness that this is also someone else's resource and being able to share it. So I guess my question for you is, in today's age of sprinklers and suburbs and lawns, what do you think is the biggest obstacle to thinking of water in that more resource of the commons type of way? And do you think that there is a way to start overcoming that?
Well, I'm not sure the ancient world has that much wisdom. I think, so what I've seen in studying the private law, which is really my area of expertise, is that there has to be some sense of community around the rules. And that without some, there are some people who follow the rules just because there is a rule. I mean, there's scholarship in the legal area that says, look, some people follow the rules. If you just tell them there's a rule, they do it because people are like that. But not everybody will. So I think there has to be a recognition of the incentives, the reasons why people break the rules. And in the Roman world, it may simply be, for some people, subsistence. For other people, it may be just the same as in the modern world of greed. So I think you need to address those issues and make people somehow, or at least get them into some kind of conversation about as Catherine was saying earlier, what are the trade-offs? What am I costing when I use this resource? For what benefits? And how do I personally evaluate those trade-offs? And what are the larger social decisions? I don't say decisions, but values about those trade-offs. Can we come to some consensus within communities? I think it's difficult. I don't really know how. I'm not a policy wonk person, so I'm probably the wrong person. Daniel probably can answer this better than I can. How communities do these things, but. I guess that's what I would say. So embed the rules in some other larger kind of community.
Hello. This question is for Mr. Lopez. Thank you very much for that talk. It was really good for me to be reminded of kind of the impacts of our actions. And I feel that if we really start thinking about, eating strawberries in winter, those kind of things, I think it's just good to that kind of academic work can have an impact on that kind of ethical questions. But I have a kind of a set of questions for you, which are about kind of transnational support for this group of local activists. So what can you say about the transnational support for that group? Is there like international NGOs working on the same issues? The second question is, to what extent does that local group in that village or place where they grow strawberries connect to other indigenous communities, but also connect to other kind of protesters? Because I imagine that in Mexico there's more than just one place where something similar is happening. So to what extent do they connect to those? And maybe you can, if you have time for the kind of third sub-question, is there like a special, the importance of, let's say, is there child labor, or is there like the exploitation of women? Is that like an issue that they kind of try to address in particular? Thank you.
Those are all good questions, and thanks. I'll tackle the first one. There's a group called El Frente Indígena de Organizaciones Binacionales, which is the indigenous front of binational organizations, which used to be centrally located in Oaxaca. Now they have offices in Tijuana, along the border, and in indigenous farm worker communities in California. Now, what they've been able, and in Oaxaca, what they've been able to do is do quite a bit of transnational organizing. And when Gabino Cu was elected governor of the state of Oaxaca a few years ago, he represented it. He named the head of that organization, Rufino Dominguez, to be basically a representative of the Oaxacan diaspora, for the Oaxacan diaspora. And so what Dominguez has been doing is going to different communities where there are Oaxacan farm workers and trying to find ways to integrate them into local communities, and then also finding ways to organize transnationally around these issues. The problem with Baja California is that there's been a large level of clientelism that's happened over this history of organizing. It just didn't start. It's been going on since the 1970s. And so in many ways, the PRI, which was the lead political party in Mexico for quite a long time, would play different colonias against each other. And in many ways, a lot of times there are other people from the field in the past who would come in, and there was one guy in particular who was thought of as being corrupt. So they kicked him out of the community. So now with the reformation of the FIOB and transnational organizing, there's a hesitation in terms of branching out to other organizations. At this point, there is no transnational organizing in this community whatsoever. There's been discussions about it, I'll leave it right there, but I had to do this, but nothing to this point. And in terms of child labor and sexual violence, I'll put it in the fields, that does exist. One thing that happened is that in the late 1990s, there was a lot of fire what happens is when you bring in transnational firms and they're producing strawberries or tomatoes for markets in the United States, then those firms like Driscoll Berry, for instance, want to hold the growers accountable for some things, child labor being one of the big things. So they are no longer able to hire anybody who's over or younger than the age of 16 during the school year. And when there is no school, when kids are on vacation, they can hire as low, I believe, as 14. That doesn't mean there isn't any child labor. What happens with some firms is that workers will bring their children, because everything's on piece rate. They'll bring their children to work, and the children will do some of the harvesting, but they're not on the books. And lastly, in terms of sexual violence, that happens quite a bit. There was one woman who we interviewed who the foreman was going after her daughter, who was 12 years old, and saying how pretty she looked and all that, and finally she stepped in. And there's this code of silence. You don't say anything. You don't stand up for anybody because you lose your job, which is there's a lack of employment there because there's so many folks there. Or at sometimes what happens, they do a bus system for picking up people from colonias one farm, for instance, if anybody says anything from that one work crew, they will ban that bus from coming back to that firm. So everybody loses out, and then you have to go back home and face the humiliation and shame by everybody who you work with. So this code of silence of not saying anything. And going back to the situation with the woman, she couldn't find work out of that after that. She spoke up, and we met her at the Human Rights Office in the center of town, and she spent time after time looking for work, and her daughter, when we tried asking questions, her daughter just was trying to blow it off because she already knew that code of silence. So.
Thanks. Sorry to target you, Mr. Lopez, but I have two more questions for you. Is there any work being done to secure citizenship for the indigenous workers so that way they actually have certificates of birth that will, legally give them rights to that Social Security?
Yes. So it's coming from two ways. The first one is from the region. The Human Rights Office is through the UN Declaration of Human Rights, there has to be a Human Rights Ombudsman, and they have an office in San Quintin. The problem, and they had a campaign in order to gain the birth certificates, and I had a picture in there, I just didn't show it, but it's files and files. So the process is that you go around, you ask people who don't have, who are those who don't have birth certificates in a community, so you have to do quite a bit of walking through communities to ask. And then you have to find out the community that person came from in rural Oaxaca, and then send a letter to rural Oaxaca, and basically the town clerk in some small village has to respond to it and say, yes, this person was born here in this community, and send it back. So just doing that work costs quite a bit of money, and so the Ombudsman Office was subsidizing that work. But what happened while we were there was that there was a prison riot in northern New Mexico, and the governor came under a lot of heat for basically closing the doors and letting the fractions of the people in the prison riot, the different fractions in the prison, go at it, and then when it was all over, step in. So after the report came out, the governor came in and defunded most of the activities of the Human Rights Office. So that's one thing. The other thing that's happening, which is, again, difficult, is that the state of Oaxaca and the representative that they have, Rufino Dominguez, that's one of his jobs, is to try to find that, get people access to the records. But again, that's a defunded office, and that takes time. So it's very difficult to do.
And on the level of the grower and firm relationship, are there any nonprofits working to be able to actually set up that land for growers and workers to be able to yield crops without, not from the Driscoll-Berry, platform of really trying to make a lot of money, but more so trying to, the fair trade aspect of it?
No fair trade. So the growers that are in Baja are not small scale. These are guys who, they've been land and water barons for quite a bit of time, and what they're looking to do is make more money through the export market. So there is no nonprofit that does that type of work. It's not like the US or like California where you have NGOs that try to work with farm workers and transfer them to being growers. It's a whole different ballgame.
If I may, I would love to ask a question of Cynthia and Danielle. Particularly, your two talks got me thinking about scales of engagement and the sort of all of the different scales of governance. And I've been talking with my students a lot about the different meanings of governance. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about where scale comes in, because you've talked about the judicial branch and you've talked about all these different sort of branches. But I'm curious about this sort of in-between spaces and the importance of those, whether people use those in-between spaces. I don't know if you could tell that from the ancient case, whether you can see the interactions between the different scales, but it's something I'm interested in.
Scales. So I want to make sure I understand what you're asking. So you mean in terms of having a federal system as opposed to a local government? Well, it's all local in the Roman world. So it's a question of how many resources you have personally, and are you able to move yourself to the place where the court is and actually use the legal system? So do you have the leisure to do that? Like, is someone, are you a large landowner who someone else is actually doing the work, and so you can go to court to defend your interests? Or are you a small landowner who maybe owns 1 or 2 slaves who can be doing the work and you're free to go? So there's a range of people who are able to access the system. You do have to do it all in person. And so if you are in Italy, you would probably go to either to Rome or to a local town. If you're out in one of the provinces, you'd have to go to the province capital where the magistrates are that run the court. So there's no real, I mean, there's actually using the legal system. This is why I like Ellickson so much, because there's actually using the legal system, and then there's, using, there's a legal case that comes after someone has cut off a channel, for his neighbor. So there's those kinds of informal mechanisms that are used, but there's no real in between either, unless, so once you get into the legal system, right, then so you go to the magistrate, you file your case, maybe it works, and then you can, in the imperial period, you can appeal to the emperor, like the people in this case did. And so we don't have enough evidence to tell how often that happened. We know there are lots of rescripts. There is one inscription from, I think it's Syria or Turkey, I can't remember now, where we know that the emperor intervened in the favor of smallholders. So there is some evidence that the system does work on these different levels. Is that what you were asking? Okay.
Thank you for the question. The issue of scale. Let me try to separate. If you see it from a social movement point of view, analysis, you could say that one of the main problems with the social demand about the Riachuelo Basin problems was that social demands were extremely fragmented and focalized. They didn't scale up. Okay, so you have an incident of pollution. So this is a basin with 6 million people. Okay, so you have an incident of pollution in some part. You have the neighbors mobilizing there, carrying the streets, and you have a quick reaction from the local government. But these local efforts were not articulated at the level of a policy of a basin, okay? So the interesting thing, and on the one hand, one could argue that, could give 2 explanations for this. One from the social movement point of view, say, well, you have a problem of social articulation, okay, so it's a social movement problem. But from an institutional point of view, you could say, well, the problem is that you didn't have a locus of institutional power at the basin level. So if you had a problem with the basin, where were you going to claim? If you were a neighbor, you were going to your closer governmental authority, which is your local mayor. But the local mayor couldn't, maybe he could, take some measure to solve the emergency, but he couldn't solve the structural problems. So the intervention of the court, it changed, and this is one of them, changed the scale of how the problem was framed. Okay, so now the policy discussion was at the level of the basin, and the court intervention forced the government, the 3 basic levels of government, the city of Buenos Aires, the province, and the federal government, to create an interjurisdictional, a locus of decisions, state decision at the basin level. So we have the institutional problem solved, but the social movement problem has not been solved. Because to access to this policy-making level, it is very demanding in terms of skills and resources. So the social actors that could play that game were only relative professionalized environmental NGOs, human NGOs, human rights NGOs. So local groups, local neighborhood residents have a lot of problems to get access to this new level of institutional decision making. So problem scale is a main issue here. Thank you.
Daniel, please stay at the microphone. My question's for you. And it follows up on Casey's question. I'm very curious as to how the Supreme Court ended up taking the Mendoza case. And specifically, you said that the plaintiffs asserted individual and collective damage, and I'd like to know more about what that damage was and what evidence they put forward to demonstrate that damage had been done.
Okay. Well, I didn't address this issue because that's for another paper. But basically, why the court got involved. Courts, especially Supreme Court, are political actors. So please do not take this idea of courts and judges as technocratic bureaucrats that take decisions according to the text of the law. These are, especially the Supreme Court, are extremely political actors, and they take their decision taking into account the political context. A great research question is why the court, if you take, let's say you put as a baseline the return to democracy, you have a relatively autonomous judiciary power. Why it took from 1983 to 2006 for the Supreme Court to get involved if the social environmental of the problem eventually were there? And that we have to go into the political context of the moment. During the 90s, there was a very, the Supreme Court was lost all its legitimacy. It was basically a court that was the government from the 90s, the Menem administration packed the court, so it was a court that didn't have any legitimacy. And, opinion polls, who trust the court in Argentina? I think the Supreme Court was about 50% of the population, something like that. In the US, it's over 50%. Just to give you an idea. So, 2003, there is a change of, there are successive changes. In 2003, a new government came in. It forced the resignation of several of the judges who were part of the previous coalition. Okay? And this new administration appointed, with a broad political support, some very well-known and respectful legal scholars. So this scholar, what they took, the main challenge now, the justice of the Supreme Court, was to rebuild the legitimacy of the Supreme Court. So the Riachuelo Matanza case was a perfect case for them, because it allows them to move into a question in which there was broad public opinion concern that something has to be done, okay? It didn't went against a particular political party, because you have different political coalitions governing the government of the city of Buenos Aires, the province, and the national government. So it basically was a situation the Supreme Court was searching for rebuilding its legitimacy as an institution, okay? So there are other explanations, but that's the one that I would go for. Regarding the other legal claim, it's interesting, because the lawyers who brought the claim were not people involved in public interest litigation, were common lawyers who were looking for a good case. So they make the claim, they went into these very poor slums, and they got people to sign a paper saying that, you know, they give the lawyer, I don't know how to say it in English, but the representation to bring a claim. So this group of lawyers, basically liability lawyers, civil liabilities, they brought this case in which their main interest were the individual damage. The money was there. The public policy issue, which was the collective damage, was brought, but was not really their concern. When the court received the issue, the court didn't want to get involved into the civil liability damage. I mean, that was not increasing their legitimacy as an institution. On the other hand, was recreating this idea of lawyers seeking money and going into industries and closing down industries. So what the Supreme Court did is say, okay, the civil liability claims are, it's like if you have a car damage, go to the court and say how the polluting industry had impacted you, go there and claim. But we are going to take the public policy case, which is the collective environmental damage, okay? So that's the distinction. In fact, an interesting thing is, after that division, these individual lawyers didn't play much role at the Supreme Court. In fact, were the environmental NGO and the human rights NGO, the public interest litigation, that became a main actor in the judicial procedure.
Great. I'd love to give everyone of our speakers a chance to give about 2 minutes of concluding remarks. What? You don't have time? Tim says no time. In that case, let's give a great round of applause for our wonderful speakers.